How's it going, everyone? My name is Byron Woodfork. I am a senior software engineer based out of Chicago, Illinois, and I've been writing code roughly for about 9 years or so professionally. And I wanted to tell the story about how I was almost fired from my software engineering internship at the start of my career, in hopes that this story helps to resonate with some of you who are either just breaking into tech, or you are a junior engineer, or you're an intern and you're just trying to figure out how not to get fired, as well as just hoping to hear about the stories of other people that were going through similar struggles as you and found out how to pull themselves out of that hole. In order to tell the story, I have to give a bit of background information. Roughly about 9 years or so ago, I had just got my first job in tech as an intern at this company called Eighth Light. And Eighth Light was is this software consultancy. And at the time, the company had this basis of an apprenticeship, and the apprenticeship program was actually really amazing. It was basically a program whereas they would bring people in and teach them both how to code and code professionally, and how to be a software consultant, and how to build quality and robust code in the process of doing so, right? And for me, my apprenticeship or my internship was to last about a year's time, right? And in that year's time, I was going to be given projects that were going to be like small projects and essentially build up to more. And eventually I would be writing code for actual clients professionally. So roughly about 6 months into my internship, at the time I had learned a couple of different programming languages. I knew basic HTML, I knew basic CSS. I also knew how to write code in Ruby and how to write code in Clojure. And my mentors wanted to give me a larger project. At the time leading up to this, I had only written like a tic-tac-toe program, both in Ruby and Clojure. So I knew how to do basic programming and how to build like a small game, but I hadn't done anything web related just yet. So my mentors decided to give me this project, which was to build an HTTP server written in the Java language, right? And to build an HTTP server, you have to have a fairly fundamental understanding of the HTTP interface, right? Like the hypertext transfer protocol interface, and essentially knowing things such as what a post request is, what a put request is, what a get request is, and all these other things. And at the time, this was all brand new to me, right? So they gave me this project of writing an HTTP server in Java from scratch. And at the time, this was the largest project that I've been given, really, because prior to this, I was writing like tic-tac-toe in a couple of different languages. So so this was actually a really great learning experience and an introductory to writing web applications. So at the start of the project, I was both learning how to code in Java, as well as learning what an HTTP server even was, for that matter. So this is a really great learning experience. And in the process of doing this, I would sit down with my mentors and, we would have regular check-ins. So I got to like the halfway point, whereas I was pretty comfortable around my knowledge of what an HTTP server was and my knowledge around actually writing Java code. And my mentors wanted me to pick a due date for when this project would be done and delivered, right? So the goal of this project, as this was the halfway point of my internship, right? Mind you, I said that my internship lasted a year, and this is the 6-month mark. So we're right smack dab in the middle, right? So my mentors were like, hey, we want to pick a date for you to actually deliver this HTTP server. And the code that you write for this is going to be reviewed by several other software engineers. And at that time, we're going to determine whether or not you move on to the next phase in your apprenticeship, which is to write production code, or if we decide to do other things, right? And those other things could mean you get fired, or it could mean various other, you don't want to know what those other things mean, right? Like, you just want to complete the project successfully. At least that's, how I had it in my mind, right? And my mentor wouldn't say what those other things was. He just said, we have to look and determine what we're going to do in terms of your apprenticeship. Right. They don't want to scare you. So my mentors and I agree with a date that I picked. I said, hey, I'm going to deliver this HTTP server on this date, and, it's going to be amazing, blah, blah, right? Didn't work out like that. So towards the end of this project, I found myself in a bit of a conundrum. So one week, this was about a week before I had to deliver the project and actually submit it for the other software engineers to actually review it and determine what was going to happen with my internship. I was sitting in the office and I am trying to make the code do what I want it to do, but it won't. And I can't fully understand why, right? So I had pulled another software engineer aside and I asked like, hey, could you help me? I'm like having trouble trying to understand like why my code isn't working the way that I want it. And, so he sat down with me for a minute and he reviewed my code. And then we started to whiteboard exactly how my code was communicating to itself, essentially, right? So whiteboarding what classes were talking to what and what classes had what responsibility. And at the end of this whiteboard session, he essentially was like, yeah, so you basically wrote spaghetti code and you have circular dependencies and it'll be like almost impossible to get the code to do what you want it to do the way that you've written it. And mind you, this is about a week out of me having to deliver this project. So I spent the next week just trying to figure out like how to back out of this problem this corner that I put myself in with this bad code that I had written, right? And for some background, everyone's HTTP server in the apprenticeship had to pass an acceptance test suite. And this acceptance test suite essentially ran tests against your HTTP server to determine whether or not it had like a post request ability to send data or get data, as well as it had like a load test, whereas it would check to see whether or not your server could handle a flurry of requests, right? And as well as some other tests that were of that nature to ensure that your HTTP server was pretty decent, right? And the tests were failing for me because I had written this spaghetti code. I couldn't figure out how to get them to pass. So I'm just chugging away trying to figure out how to back myself out of the corner that I put myself in with this really bad code. And I remember I was in the office late at night until about 10 p.m. and I'm just trying to figure out how to back myself out of this corner that I had written myself into with my horrible code. And because myself as well as my mentors agreed that I would deliver this code by the next day and have it submitted to all of these software engineers that were gonna review it for me, I had to send it off. So I sent my mentors the link to the repository, and in an email that I sent, I just let them know like, hey, I backed myself into a corner with this code that I've written, right? Like this is spaghetti code and I can't figure out how to untangle it really. And they just acknowledged the email, but this was like super late at night and I was just feeling distraught and defeated. And I remember I'm walking to the bus to take the bus home and it's like super late. And I just call my mom and I'm like, Mom, I'm about to get fired. And I am bawling my eyes out, right? Like I am crying. I'm like, Mom, they are about to fire me. I'm like, I was supposed to complete this project and I was doing my best to complete it and I just could not figure it out. And my mom, she's doing her best to just assure me that everything is all good, and she's like, don't worry too much until something happens, right? So so fast forward past that, about a week later, my mentors, they come and sit me down and they're like, hey, so we reviewed your code and it's bad. Is basically what he said. I don't remember his exact words in that moment because all I could hear was just blood rushing to my eardrums. I could not hear anything. And then one thing I do remember is he just said, so we're not going to fire you, but the topic did come up as to whether or not we should. And my heart was just like in my stomach, right? Like I just, at that time, like I just felt just the lowest of low, the lowest of low that I could feel. So my mentor, he explained, he was like, hey, so what we're going to do is we're going to give you an opportunity to resubmit this. And we want you to pick a date of which you'll be done by, and you get a chance to redo the project entirely. He's like, I want you to start from scratch. He basically explained, like, just forget, the code that you've already written. Just start a new project from scratch. And while I was just mentally down, in that week that they took to review my code, what I had started to do was look back at and like try to figure out the mistakes that I made. And I was like, all right, so if I wrote this from scratch, how would I have done it knowing what I know now? And I started mapping things out in my mind and looking at what I had written, as well as just looking at some existing open source HTTP servers out there as well to see what other people had did with the servers that they wrote. And I was and like trying to get some ideas. So I'd spent that time not just like sulking. I was like, hey, I know I suck. I need to get better. Right? That was my main goal. And so anyway, so my mentor explains like, hey, we're going to give you this project again, and we want you to let us know when you're going to have it done by. And immediately I just like, while I was feeling down, I immediately knew I was about to kill it this time. I just knew that, right? Like there was no doubt in my mind that like this time I was going to have my T's crossed and my I's dotted. Like it was going to be some of the best code that I ever written in my life, wrote in my life at the time anyway. So they gave me the project again. And this time what I did, because I know the wise man knows that he does not know all, my mentors were actually off site, right? So I was in our company's main office, but my mentors, they worked at different company locations. So my main mentor, he was actually based in LA and I was based in Chicago. So that was like a tough thing in itself. And my other mentor, he was actually working at a client site. So they weren't in the same office as me every day. However, there were other software engineers who were professional software engineers and weren't just apprentices or interns, who still worked in the same office that I did. So what I did this time around is I went around and I'm looking in the office to see who I could potentially ask for help. And our office was set up so that there was like these little mini offices that other software engineers worked out of. And I popped into this one office with these software engineers who I knew and were friends with. And I was like, hey, I'm actually about to restart my HTTP server and start rewriting it in Java. And I wanted to ask if, at any point in time, if I get stuck or I have any questions, or I'm like, trying to figure out the design of this project, could I ask you for help? And they were like, yeah, no problem. So what I did was I found a desk in that little office space and I just worked in there with them every day from that point on. Because prior to this, when I did it the first time, I was kind of working in a silo, right? Like I was around other software engineering interns and apprentices, but like they aren't necessarily experts on this topic, right? Like, so what I wanted to do was get myself around people who excelled in this, right? I didn't want this time to be like up to chance. So what I did was I just sat in that little office space with them. And anytime that I had a question or I was trying to figure out how to design something, or I had a Java question or HTTP server question, whatever the case may be, I would say like, hey, at any point in time, like if you all have time to answer a couple of questions I have during lunch or something, just like let me know. And they're like, yeah, like let's chat like during lunch, and we would whiteboard stuff, and it would help very quickly clear things up in my mind, any questions that I might have, right? So Another thing that I did this time around that I didn't do the first time around, and I wish I had known this at the time, was before I even wrote any code, I wanted to structure what the code architecture in my application would even look like for the most part, right? Like figuring out what classes were going to be responsible for what things, as well as figuring out how certain classes were going to communicate to one another. And this was a thing that I did not do anywhere near successfully the first time that I did this project. And that's how I backed myself into the corner of writing the spaghetti code, right? And having these circular dependencies, because I didn't have it mapped out exactly how the code was going to communicate across the board in terms of classes and stuff talking to each other and what was going to be responsible for what, right? So, so those are like two pretty big takeaways for me for how I approached the situation different this time. And about like a week or two into the project is I think when I was like 100% sure that I was going to deliver this project with like it was going to be, some of the best code that I ever written. And another thing that I did this time around that I didn't do the first time that I did this project was learn more about software design patterns, right? And prior to this time, like doing this, I was learning about software design patterns, but I wasn't fully understanding them. And I caught myself trying to forcefully implement them when I didn't need to in certain places and aspects. So this time around, as I was learning more about them, I was basically documenting to make sure that I knew and could understand fully what they did and what they were used for. And I was keeping them in the back of my mind to say, all right, once I recognize a place in my code where implementing a software design pattern makes sense, then I'll implement it, right? So that was something that I didn't do the first time around. And I would highly recommend that for anyone out there who's looking to implement a software design pattern. Don't just do it just to do it. Make sure that it has a purpose and is actually fitting properly in your code and the architecture that you're trying to create for yourself. So anyway, fast forward to the delivery date for this project. I delivered the project and they reviewed it this time around and they were like, hey, this was way better than the first project that you submitted. And we're going to move you on into the next phase of your apprenticeship, which is you working on actual client-based code. And the joy that I felt, like I can't even explain it. I was like, after that point, I knew that there was nothing else that they could throw at me that I wouldn't be able to successfully accomplish. I was like, yo, if I pulled myself out of this hole and dragged myself out of this defeat and this depression that I had slipped into from having failed the first time and feeling like I couldn't do this, I'm like, yo, there's absolutely nothing you all could throw at me in terms of a coding related aspect that I won't be able to pick up and actually kill it. So that was like a huge lesson learned for me and one of my biggest takeaways in that matter. And so to recap in the story on some of the most important lessons that I learned in going through this process in this project was a few things. One thing for sure was that I needed to map out what my code was going to look like and what it was going to do before I actually did anything, right? Like if I knew that I needed my code to do a thing, then I was like, all right, so what class do I need? What does this class need to do? What needs to talk to this class? How does this class talk to this other class, right? And figuring that out for the most part, right? And there are times where writing code to start makes sense and then you figure out the plan. However, at the time for me, I was so inexperienced that I didn't know when that stopping point needed to happen for me to then take a step back and look at things from a high level standpoint, right? So, so something that I encourage people to do, as well as if I could, look back on myself, I would say, hey, before you write any code, I want you to figure out what this class is going to look like. What's its responsibility going to be? How is it going to get created? What do the dependencies look like and things of that nature. So looking back on some of the most important lessons that I learned in this entire process, one of the most important lessons was that I needed to map out what my code was going to look like before I actually started to build anything. Now, this isn't always the best case and best thing to do. However, in my case, one thing that I had struggled with was getting too far down the rabbit hole of trying to build something that just works and not having a plan, really, right? So one thing that I did the second time around that I did the project was I had whiteboarded exactly how my code was gonna communicate with itself, right? So figuring out, okay, I'm gonna have this class that has this responsibility. I'm gonna have this class that has this responsibility, and it's gonna communicate with this class through dependency injection or what have you, right? And figuring out what that looked like from a high level standpoint and creating that battle plan before I actually sat at the keyboard and started to write anything. Another thing that I did the second time around was ensuring that I surrounded myself with people that were going to help me succeed in the endeavors that I had for myself, right? So as I mentioned before, my mentors were remote, right? So I wasn't able to see them face to face every day, just a couple of times a week. However, there were other people within the community that were accessible to me, and I had the opportunity to sit down with them and get help from them more often and throughout the week, right? So I essentially grew my mentor network, right? So sitting down with those folks and essentially surrounding myself with those people and just being in their space, right? The first time that I built the project, as I said, like I was kind of siloed and I wasn't really around other more experienced software engineers. And another really important lesson that I took away from this was to ensure that I set realistic expectations with the stakeholders, right? And this is something that any experienced software engineer will tell you to do, but at the time I had no idea how to do this. So, thinking back, like I said, there were times where I knew that, the project had went astray, but I didn't know how to correct it. And I never really communicated to my mentors like, hey, this won't be delivered by this date, but to the standard that you're expecting, right? And resetting that expectation with them and just saying like, hey, if I have another like 2 to 3 weeks, then I can deliver this to the expectation that you all have and that I have for myself, right? And I'm pretty sure, like thinking back on this, had I communicated that once I found out the issues that I was having, then they would have been like, okay, cool. We want you to be able to be in a space and a place where you feel like you'll deliver your best work. And they would have almost certainly, like wrote with that had I communicated and reset that expectation with them. However, because I didn't, then we get to the night before and I'm submitting the project and I'm like, hey, this sucks. They're like, oh, well, you decided to agree to this date and you submitted this project on this date. So here we are. Right. So so being realistic and setting expectations and having good communication with your stakeholders. And last but not least, the most important lesson that I learned from this entire experience was to just keep going, right? Like I could have given up, right? Like on that phone call with my mom on my way walking from the office late at night, I was feeling completely defeated. I felt like I was about to get fired and I felt like there was like no path forward for me after this, right? This was a make or break situation for me. And this was my first job in tech, my first job in software engineering. I was brand new to all of this and I didn't really have another path if this did not work out, right? So just having that ability to pick myself up and say, hey, you're gonna keep at this until they tell you that you can't, right? That second time around when they gave me the project, I just knew being given that second opportunity that I was gonna just kill it. Like I knew, like I just said it I had it set in my mind. I was giving myself positive affirmations. I was also doing the research leading up to that point to ensure that I knew enough to get myself started and put myself in the line of success, right? So for anyone out there who is going through similar struggles like this, either in your first job as a software engineer, or you're trying to break into being a software engineer, or you got laid off, whatever the case may be, like just keep going. just keep going. Like, you're gonna run into a brick wall. You are going, like, as just a fact. Like, I don't care where you are in your software engineering journey, at some point you're gonna fall on your face. Things are gonna seem really difficult, and you're gonna be like, man, like, is this something that I really want to do? Is this something that I want for myself? Do I believe that I can do this, right? And asking yourself those questions, right? So just, just keep going. If I could look back and give myself any advice, it would be, hey, pick yourself up, keep going. Unfortunately, I did not give up, and I kept going, and it's 9 years later. And that was the first story about how I was almost fired from my first software engineering internship. And if you've listened to me this entire time, then I want to say a huge thank you to you. And I hope that this story helped resonate with you, and share it with other people who might be going through similar struggles, right? Because sometimes we just want to hear the stories of other people who have made it to that other side and figure out how they did it, as well as like what was going through their mind and their experience. And oftentimes that can help us pull through and give us the motivation that we need to be successful. So I just want to give my thanks to my mentors, as well as the company that granted me that opportunity 9 or so years ago, as that was it was life-changing. It was life-changing. So that said, I look forward to connecting with you all in the future, in future videos, and I hope to see you around in the future. All right, later.